So let's talk about authentication, authenticating to the server. So when you send a request to the SQL API, you have to send the authentication information in the header. And so when we're constructing the header, we have to specify the authorization bearer, the authorization token type, and the Snowflake account. And the Snowflake account, we don't need that every time. We'll talk about that a little bit, but let's talk about the details of this. So as I mentioned earlier, we have two different methods that we can use for authentication. We can use OAuth, or we can use the JWT, the JSON Web Token. With the OAuth, a couple of things that we want to be aware of and look at. So if obviously OAuth tokens, if we're using SSO or an OAuth service with integration to Snowflake, then we could use the OAuth token as our token for our SQL REST, the API call. If we're using an OAuth token, we would want to make sure that we have the ability to have a browser pop, right? Because if we're going to use SSO, it's going to have to pop that so that we can get that authentication. So that's one of the things so if you got something that's, back end, you don't have any ability to deal with that, then you're going to need to go with the JWT, with the JSON Web Token or the JWT. So with the OAuth, Snowflake supports two different methods. The Snowflake OAuth, this is used by a number of like maybe the large BI tools. Some of those support that type of a OAuth connection. And then there's the external OAuth. So this is like most of the identity management services like Okta, Azure AD. And so if you go to the Snowflake, the documentation for the SQL REST API, there's detailed information step by step of how you set this up and how you configure that. And you notice our little notes down here on the bottom: keep calm and carry on. This can be, when you're first setting this up, this can be a little bit a little crazy, but just kind of step through, and if you go through and take your time, you'll be able to set that up. So so that's the OAuth token. For the authorization bearer type. We've also got the JSON Web Token. So this is generated from RSA key files, right? This is the JWT uses the pre-created public and private RSA key files that we've set up. So before we use those, we have to set up and configure that in Snowflake so that our user has that configured and set up. If you go look at the show users in Snowflake, if you go far over to the right, you'll see that that you have the RSA key set up for your user account once you've set that up. Snowflake also will support two RSA keys per user so that you can do key rotation. There's a bunch of documentation on this. If you look up key pair authentication and key pair rotation, you'll be able to see the details on that. Using key pair authentication and Snowflake SQL API, there's some great information in the docs on that. And then also, with the SnowSQL. So you use the SnowSQL API or the SnowSQL client command tool. Right, here's an example of the command that you can use to generate the actual token, which I'm going to do in a few moments here on my other screen so that I can plug that into Postman so we can actually run some of these and take a look at this. So that's our authorization, the tokens that we're going to use. Also, we mentioned that we need to do the Snowflake authorization token type. So whether we're using OAuth or the JWT, we need to tell in the header when we're constructing that, when we're authenticating to the server, we need to tell it what type of authentication we're using, whether we're using OAuth or the key pair. And if we don't indicate what we're using, OAuth is the default. So if we're using OAuth, we don't have to pass this in because that's the default. But so if you're using key pair, you got to pass this in every time. The Snowflake account. So the Snowflake account with the account name. So if we're going to submit queries to URLs with the account name and organization, and OAuth only, then we've got to send in the Snowflake account. So if we're using, like it says here, if we're using an URL that specifies the account name in an organization, like the example that we showed, myorg-myaccount.snowflakecomputing.com, then we must explicitly specify the account name in our post and using that Snowflake dash account. We don't have to use this. We don't have to put this in if we're using the account, the locator and the region in our URI, or if we're using the JWT authentication, then we don't have to use this. Make sure that if you're using OAuth and you're using org and account name, that you do that so you're not pulling out your hair trying to figure out what in the world's going on.
Hey folks, thanks for checking out this cut from our broadcast. To see the full show, click on the link in the video description. Also, check out our Learning Center, which has white papers, events, live streams, and short explainer videos on a wide range of data management topics. And of course, if you like our content, please share it on LinkedIn. That really means a lot to us. Thanks again for checking us out, and we hope to see you in our next broadcast.